Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colin Price. I'm a first-year MBA student at Harvard Business School. I'm joined by Lee Center, a second-year student at HBS and also one of the co-presidents of the Conservative Club. We're very happy to bring to you the next panel on the topic, Great Power Competition. Before we begin, I'll review the panel specifics. We'll start with some opening remarks from our panelists. And then please utilize the QR code on the tables or in the program to send your questions to Lee, who will present them to the panel. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our guests today. Congressman Dan Crenshaw represents Texas' 2nd Congressional District. Previously, he served 10 years in the United States Navy as a Navy SEAL and completed 5 deployments overseas. In Congress, he serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which has the broadest jurisdiction of any legislative committee in Congress. On this committee, he serves on the Subcommittee on Health, as well as the Subcommittee on Environment, Manufacturing, and Critical Materials, and the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. He also serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. On this committee, he serves on the Central Intelligence Agency Subcommittee and the National Intelligence Enterprise Subcommittee. Dr. William Ruger serves as the president of the American Institute for Economic Research in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He is a veteran of the Afghanistan War and remains an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserves. Dr. Ruger was nominated by President Trump to serve as the United States Ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and was appointed by the President to the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board in 2020. Dr. Ruger earned his PhD in politics from Brandeis University and an AB from the College of William & Mary. Dr. Jeremy Friedman is an associate professor in the Business, Government, and International Economy Unit at Harvard Business School, where he teaches a course on business and geopolitics. Before that, he was the associate director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy at Yale University. A historian of Russia and China who received his PhD from Princeton University in 2011, he has written 2 books, including Shadow War, The Sino-Soviet Competition for the Third World, and Ripe for Revolution, Building Socialism in the Third World. Gentlemen, on behalf of the students across Harvard University, we'd like to thank you for being here today and sharing with us your valuable perspective. We will now begin our opening remarks, and Congressman Crenshaw, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Great to be back with some Harvard folks. I jumped at the chance to talk to y'all, the lonely conservatives in the great crimson ocean of whatever. So it's good to be back. I'll try and keep it short. I don't have any opening remarks really about great power competition. I think your questions will push us in the right direction in a more interesting way. I think it's obvious that we're in a new era that is similar to old eras. I think we had a very unique time in history over the last 70 years where, in a post-World War II era where it just wasn't normal anymore for countries to invade other countries because they like their stuff, even though that was normal in history for a very, very, very long time. And that's largely because of the American superpower, which obviously was even more pronounced after the fall of the Soviet Union. And now, inevitably, there are other powers that just get bigger. They're growing, they're ambitious, and they're China and Russia in its own kind of maniacal way, and Iran, and North Korea, around the world. And so the proportional strength of the United States, changes. And that's okay, and it worries a lot of people. I would still say I'm going to always bet on the USA. There has been a lot of dumb people trying to screw this country up for like 250 years, and yet we are remarkably stable. We have a remarkably stable constitution. We are blessed with all sorts of resources, even if we choose not to mine and process them. But in an emergency, in theory, we could, because we have them. We have all the energy we could ever need for thousands of years. We're protected by 2 oceans on either side. Canada is like this almost annoyingly nice neighbor, and Mexico is something else. But, it ain't Russia. I'm going down to Mexico this next week, actually. So we'll see how that goes. So I think we're remarkably lucky. We don't have the same demographic aging problems that some of these other countries do that we just mentioned. And we continue to have a very dynamic economy despite the best efforts of the regulatory scheme of the Biden administration, adding hundreds of billions of dollars a year in extra costs on businesses and your way of life. But the American worker, the American entrepreneur continues to thrive even through that. And it's amazing to think what would happen if you took more of those gloves off, took more of that red tape off. We would be completely unstoppable. Our biggest problems are probably our inner divides. I'm not even saying just between the left and the right. That's the most obvious one, but between the left and between the right and the right, it is the most exhausting part of my job. So with that, I think I'll just leave it and go on to Will.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I spoke at Princeton yesterday, Harvard today. What's wrong with Yale, right? I mean, come on. I want to start, with a couple of things as context. So one of the things I think that when we discuss great power competition, American foreign policy, we have to remember is that essentially the last 20 to 30 years of American foreign policy has been an absolute disaster. And I think that's important context. I think it should give us greater humility about our ability to accomplish all the ends that our political leaders might want us to, and I'd quibble with some of those ends. But the problem we've had, right, is whether it's Iraq, whether it's the Afghanistan nation building effort, whether it's Syria, Somalia, Libya, which is an underrated disaster. You have President Obama talking about R2P, which I've never seen as a vital national interest of ours, to basically have altruism, and that's something that I think all conservatives will agree on. Arms flowed out, terrorists flowed in. You had several governments competing. You had a refugee crisis that destabilized Europe. Mali was destabilized. I mean, just an absolute train wreck. But that's one of those things that's been a kind of hallmark of in your whole life. For most of you are probably 20 to 25 years old. The hallmark of your life has been a disastrous American foreign policy. Now I hate to have that happen because I'm a patriot. I believe in our country. I loved what the congressman said about America. It is still our last best hope for liberty and a flourishing society in the world. So it's terrible that we've had this tragedy, and it's harmed so many of our shipmates and so many of our soldiers, sailors, and our soldiers and airmen. But what I think we have to kind of confront that challenge right up front, that it has been a disaster. It's not just the obvious ones like Iraq. It's also been other things. So, for example, how we've handled the rise of China, how we've dealt with expanded NATO in a way that has been a cause of instability as opposed to a cause for stability. And so, again, it's almost hard to see where they've gotten things right. And again, there are some things, but the whole picture is a problem. The second thing is I would talk about, and it's almost like, I don't think I did this the last time we talked, so I don't say it every time, but you don't want to think about what Karl von Clausewitz, the famous Prussian general, talked about, right? Which is that you need to focus on ends when you think about statecraft, because war is politics by other means. And the ends of politics, right, are those things that we should be thinking about when we think about warfare. And so I like to talk about how my approach to foreign policy, which is what you might call realism and restraint or just restraint, is that it starts from this notion of ends. What are the ends that the United States should be fighting and dying for? And I think there are three major ones. One is our territorial integrity, our homeland security, right? The protection of America. And that should be primary. In that sense, I don't shrink from the term America first, because I think that is the purpose of government, to secure America, and our homeland security is most important among them. Secondly, I would say would be the conditions of our economic prosperity. And that means things like freedom of lawful navigation, because we are a trading country, we're a commercial republic in so many ways, and so it is important for us to secure our ability to connect with the rest of the world in terms of our commerce. And thirdly would be our liberal democratic system here at home. And when I say liberal, I don't mean like Mike Dukakis. I mean in terms of the kind of liberalism broadly understood of John Locke that was embraced by our founders and was a core bedrock, and is a core bedrock of our republic. I think those are the things that are our vital national interests. Those are the things worth fighting and dying for. And so the question then is, what are the best means to secure those things in the threat environment we faced? And I'm glad the Congressman touched on some things, like the fact that we have weak and friendly neighbors, the fact that we have two big moats between us and the rest of the world, the fact that we still have a very strong conventional capability despite some of our inability to do well in the desert. We still have the ability to conventionally deter and defend our country with our great Navy, great Air Force, and so forth. And then also another kind of important feature of the security environment is that we have nuclear weapons. And I think the nuclear revolution is underrated by Americans in terms of how much it creates security for the United States. It's not going to stop, something like the 9/11 attackers from getting a lucky shot and severely harming us in New York and at the Pentagon. But we were resilient and we were able to prevail. It's not an existential threat. But the idea of, for example, another state invading, attacking the United States and being able to secure a beachhead on our shores is impossible as long as we maintain a strong nuclear deterrent. And we have the willpower in the White House and in Congress to defend ourselves when it comes to it. And I think that means that we have a luxury where our security is over-determined. And so that's why I bristle sometimes when I watch the TV or I read the Wall Street Journal and I hear about all these threats. And I think there's a massive amount of threat inflation in our politics. It sells, right? It's not very sexy to say, yes, yet again, another day in which our nuclear weapons kept us safe from our peer competitors, right? That's not going to be on the news. And again, when we do have threats like terrorism, it's important to have guys like this, right, special operators, who can reach out and touch those terrorists that have the intent and capability to harm the United States and use our over-the-horizon capabilities to attrit or decimate them. So there's all kinds of ways in which we can keep ourselves safe. And I think we have to steward our golden goose, which is our economy, because as Admiral Mike Mullen said when he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is that the debt and deficit is our greatest national security threat. I thought he was going to say Iran or China or terrorism, but he said our debt and deficits because it's pointed out that our military power relies on a strong economy. And so we can't have the kind of economic policies that undermine that. And so I think our greatest threat is actually ourself in so many ways. And I think that's what Admiral Mullen was talking about. And again, we have to steel ourselves for great power competition, particularly with China. But it does mean making trade-offs between different types of efforts. And that's why I'm with people like Bridge Colby, who served in the Trump administration, and talking about how that we have to make trade-offs between the Middle East and Europe and China. China is our most important strategic competitor, and so it's important to think about that. But again, back to my restraints. So if you have the ends if you think about the ends I believe in, and if you think about the threat environment I've laid out, and if you think about our recent history of going abroad in search of monsters to destroy and ending up creating problems for ourselves, I think that all adds up that we should follow a grand strategy or a foreign policy of restraint, which would mean that we need to reduce our security commitments to the rest of the world. We need to push greater burden sharing and burden shifting towards Europe. We should not allow them to be welfare recipients that are on the backs of the American economy. The European countries combined are more populous and more wealthy than the United States. They could defend themselves if they had the will to do so. And that would allow us to focus on our most salient threats. The Middle East is a quagmire we should stay out of largely, and we don't need to have alliances or special relationships with Saudi Arabia or others, right? We need to actually follow the Washingtonian tradition of greater non-entanglement. And also approaching the world in a way in which we don't think about permanent enemies and permanent friends, that we're much more flexible. And that was something that Washington talked about in his farewell address, because you have to be flexible in international politics. And the congressman talked about how the future era is going to be more like past eras. And in the 18th and 19th century, there were much more flexible international relations because you had to maneuver in that competitive environment and not just stick with old mantras. I mean, I'm tired of hearing about the so-called liberal international order and what that means Americans have to die for. You know, it's a lot of hypocrisy. It's kind of like Voltaire and the Holy Roman Empire not being Holy Roman nor an empire. The international liberal order is hardly liberal international or ordered, as we've seen in the Middle East, right? Massive instability. So I think we have to be careful about entanglements, and I think we have to be careful about what we use force for. I think we need to make sure that we use force minimally, consistent with Washington's Great Rule. We don't go and do nation building. We don't do democracy promotion. That's not the job of the American military. The job of the American military should be to deter and defend against attacks against the United States and our interests. And we ought to think about it that way. And that may mean we need to use force, particularly when it comes to counterterrorism. It may mean we need to use force to protect our freedom of lawful navigation. But what it doesn't mean is what we've been basically doing over the last 30 years. We need to change. Realism and restraint is that answer.
Thank you guys for having me. Thank you to Lee and Colin. So one of the disadvantages of going third in a panel like this is that almost inevitably something you wanted to say has been said already. That's true for both Congressman Crenshaw and for Professor Ruger. But there are important ways, I think, in which we also disagree. So I want to just set out a couple of ideas here. I think to a large degree, the Republican Party, the conservative movement, is still sort of undecided on a foreign policy path beyond either neoconservatism, which is, I think, largely discredited, and sort of America First, which has essentially come to replace it institutionally. But there is really no kind of middle way, no sort of third path between those two. I think that's been fully articulated. So I would want to begin sort of thinking about what a conservative foreign policy looks like based on one of my favorite definitions of conservatism, at least, from Roger Scruton, who said that conservatism begins with the sentiment that good things are easy to destroy but hard to construct. So if we take that sentiment and we think about, I would not call it the liberal international order, but let's call it the post-World War II order. In many ways, there are a lot of things the United States has benefited from the post-World War II order. Right? Congressman Crenshaw talked about how the United States has really enjoyed a lot of security and prosperity in the past 70 years. And so if you take this idea that good things are easy to destroy but hard to construct, I think it behooves us to look at the world order and say, okay, what are the things we want to keep? Right? What are the things that are worth preserving? And those things, will match America's interest, but might match America's interest in a broader way than defending our shores. So I think it's worth a close look, right? I mean, the United States has been tremendously prosperous. We have avoided foreign troops on our shores. The United States has been able to achieve not everything, but a lot of what it wanted internationally in the past 70 years. And so before we sort of abandon the post-World War II order, we should think, what do we want to keep? What would be, easy to destroy, but hard to construct or reconstruct in this case? And the United States, as Congressman Crenshaw says, enjoys many existing advantages. So under the current circumstances, the United States is advantaged by its demography, it's advantaged by its geography. It's even advantaged by certain legacy institutions. So as much as, I think we all have critiques of Harvard, the fact that the United States has Harvard, I'll, stand in my business school professor's shoes and talk about the value of Harvard's brand equity, is something that we don't want to destroy, right? These are institutions that we have that China and Russia would like to have, right? The American cultural apparatus, which is, depends on the dominance of English. So we have many structural advantages. And so the United States has a position in the world that is worth defending at some point. The question is, what do we need to defend to keep that position in the world? So I want to talk about, to a certain degree, American foreign policy is not just about what Americans want, but what our potential adversaries want. So let's talk about Russia and China, because that's really what I study. I think a new Cold War, which is the kind of phrase that's been thrown around, is a bad way to look at things. I think that's part of the reason it's a bad way to look at things is because Americans have been told this story about the history of American foreign policy, right? Professor Ruger talked about, dragons to slay abroad. The idea that, America finds an evil enemy, and then it ends with either, unconditional surrender, regime collapse, something of, regime reconstruction and such. I think not only is that a bad paradigm for thinking about Russia and China today. I think that is a mistake to look back at the Cold War and project onto the Cold War. That was, there's the idea that George Kennan foresaw all of this and it happened exactly as he imagined. But if you were sitting in, the Oval Office with Nixon and Kissinger in 1970, that was not the world they saw. That was not the world they imagined. That was not the world they were planning for. American policy was not directed towards the collapse of the Soviet Union for 50 years. That is a false narrative. So the idea is that we do not need to fight a war predicated on, mutually exclusive global power, that it's either us or the Chinese, and as long as the CCP regime is around, we can't be safe or something. No, we have to find a way to deal with them, but dealing with them means understanding how the regimes work. Understanding them at multiple levels. So right now, there is a Sino-Russian alliance, which is significant, but also incredibly shallow. This alliance is really two people deep. This is Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, both of whom are in their early 70s, who share a particular vision of world order, which is why they threaten American world order, because they see their world order and American world order as mutually exclusive. But if Vladimir Putin had a heart attack and died tomorrow, the person who took his place would not necessarily see Russian interests the same way. There are a lot of people at high levels in Beijing who do not see Chinese interests the way Xi Jinping sees them. So we have to keep in mind that, yes, we are currently facing a quasi-Sino-Russian alliance that has this maximalist view of the world, but it could change very quickly, and they don't represent fundamental Russian and Chinese interests. There are other ways, contra John Mearsheimer, that a Russian president could act, or a Chinese president could act. So we have to have this policy in which, we don't want to isolate them completely. We want to, deal with them as necessary, but also potentially prepare for the day after Putin, the day after Xi, which could be tomorrow or next week or in 10 years. We have to always look for opportunities to drive a wedge between the two of them. Because, I wrote a book on the Sino-Soviet split. China and Russia have attempted to be allies for 150 years, and it's never quite worked. So we have to have this complex policy of understanding where Xi and Putin are today, where Chinese and Russian interests could be in the future, and always looking for opportunities to separate them, right? These countries do not trust each other. There will never be a Sino-Russian NATO. They've tried it. There's a Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's gotten nowhere. They don't trust each other with their own security. So this alliance has limitations. And the final thing I will leave you with, is that ultimately I tell my students that every country exists in a permanent state of geopolitical competition, right? So every domestic policy choice you make, think about it in terms of evolutionary biology, right? It's a permanently competitive environment. A policy choice is like an adaptation, like a gene mutation, right? And those that make the right adaptations succeed, survive, and those that don't go extinct. So every time we think about domestic policy, we think about American institutions, what's happening to them, think about what this does is this going to make our country more likely to survive in the future? Is it more likely to go extinct? And so that's what I'll leave you with. At the end of the day, America has objective strengths, but it's the subjective perception of the American people about what America's strengths are that ultimately decide what kind of foreign policy this country can pursue. Thank you.
So I think a helpful first question might be maybe level setting what should the US foreign policy strategy be? Because there's often debate on both the left and the right about US interventionism. In your view, when should or must the US intervene militarily abroad? And maybe having Ukraine and Israel in mind as you're answering this question.
You want to go first?
You go first. Sure, and I guess I'll frame it as in response to what Will said. Will and I got to debate this very topic at a National Review event some time ago. It was fun. It was a little odd because I thought we were debating Ukraine. You thought we were debating just general foreign policy. So we kind of it was still a good time. When should we use it? I mean, you can't set a rule on when to use it, but I want to respond to some of the things Will said on the last 20 years of foreign policy being a disaster. I think that's extremely hyperbolic. Disaster? I don't know. The entire world is a disaster. And so when you're dealing with a disaster, it feels like a disaster the entire time. But that's the real world. Look, we get attacked on 9/11, attacked in a way that we've just never been attacked before. It shocked us. What's the alternative? So you have two choices. You take the fight right back to the people who did it, Okay, that seemed like the obvious choice. Everybody was on board with that. But then on day 2, once you've taken the fight to them, you've got to decide, okay, are we going to let them are we going to just leave them alone now? Are we going to leave them alone now so that they can commit another 9/11, that they can have the operational space and freedom to do that? And the answer from a policy perspective was no. We've got to build up forces here. You can call it nation building and call it neoconning or whatever. But in the end, we are finding our allies in a place so that our enemies in that place can't keep growing. And that's a long-term project. It is what it is. It is a disaster. But you know what else is a disaster? More 9/11s. You know what we got from 20 years of war in Afghanistan? No more 9/11s. So we did complete our mission. And I remind all our veterans that who sacrificed too, don't know why they sacrificed, because there's so much rhetoric out there that you were a waste. You were a wasted pawn from the neocons in Washington. No, you weren't. You were preventing 9/11s. Now Iraq, okay, you should all take Megan O'Sullivan's class here that really describes the actual story of how the decision-making process went into Iraq. It's more complicated than you realize. You're dealing with a dictator who won't tell you whether or not he has nuclear weapons, who's actually indicates he does, now in hindsight because he wants to deter Iran. You found a nuclear weapons program in the first Gulf War. You've basically been at war with Iraq, you know, with the no-fly zone and all that for the last few years. You just had 9/11 happen. And so they make the decision. They had some bad intel too, which is a case study now in the intelligence community on how to vet sources. In any case, it happened. It wasn't some evil scheme. It just happened. And so was it a disaster? I don't know. Well, to assess anything in history, you have to assess the counterfactual, all right? You've got to accept the multiverse, all right, in nerd terms. Time is not linear. And you have to think about what would have happened otherwise. So in Afghanistan, I think that's pretty easy. Taliban and what Al-Qaeda continue to have safe havens in Afghanistan, continue to be able to plan operations that hit the homeland. So that's as simple as that. Took a lot of sacrifice to prevent that over the years. It sucks. I'm one of them. But it is what it is. You're welcome. And the American people never paid a single bit of a price for it. Some of us did, very few. On Iraq, let's imagine the counterfactual. So Iran was well on its way to a nuclear weapons program at that time. What happened in 2004? Ayatollah says, we will not have a nuclear weapons program. Now, why do you think that was? Because they just saw George Bush invade a country on the premise of having weapons of mass destruction. And they haven't had a nuclear weapons program since. Now, obviously, they tease us about it all the time, try to get us to think they might do it again. You know the deal. But they've never gotten one. So you can imagine a world where Saddam Hussein stays in place, Iran gets a nuclear weapon, maybe lobs one at Israel, and draws us into a very serious fucking war in the Middle East. That's the counterfactual that you have to be able to imagine, and it is not a crazy counterfactual. So this stuff is complicated. It is a disaster. It's always a disaster. I don't like our choices in Russia and Ukraine. I don't like it. So on the one hand, we can let Russia just win. Let's imagine the counterfactual. We let Russia just roll over Ukraine. We never supported them. They were never our ally. They were never part of NATO. We didn't give them any special forces training. We didn't hook them up with javelins and stingers. We didn't do any of that. How would have Russia done? Really well. That's how they would have done. Ukraine would have fought really hard, but it was those Stinger missiles that stopped them in Bucha. I've seen the tanks just outside of Kiev. I went there a few months after the war started. They barely made it out, and then they pushed them all the way back. Pretty amazing stuff, but let's imagine the counterfactual. They didn't have those weapon systems they needed. They didn't have air interceptors to stop Russia's airstrikes, and Russia just makes it through. So didn't lose 87% of its forces, active duty, and like 2/3 of its reserve forces. Didn't lose thousands of planes and tanks. The military completely still intact. The Russian people totally behind Putin because they love winning more than anything else. And now a belligerent Russia is on the border of 4 NATO countries. And you're going to tell me that's a better outcome? No, that's exactly how you get into war. Because, and I want to discredit, or not discredit, I want to debate one more thing. Russia did not do this because of fear of NATO expansion. There is zero evidence for that. He'll lie about it sometimes, but all of the evidence of his speeches and everything Putin has ever said for the last 20 years is very simple. He just believes Ukraine isn't a country. He believes in a greater Russia the pre-Soviet Russia. He believes he is the czar, the next coming of the czar. He believes it's his. And he convinces the Russian people that it's his. It's really that simple. Engaging in wars of conquest is okay for some people, and it is in our interest not to let that happen. Wars of conquest, where people just took the other little guy's stuff because he has it and he can, that was history, pre-World War II. You saw about 18th, 19th century and like flexible, yeah, but you know what? We barely had running water. We didn't have iPhones. We didn't have lights on in rooms. Like, it was not a good place. You go live in that time. I don't want to live in that time. I want to live in the modern era where I can get whatever I want on Amazon in like an hour. Because the global economy has been protected by the United States of America, and that protection is messy. That protection is very, very messy. Totally agree with that. But if you just let it get chipped away at, just this country, let that one fall. That one, let that one fall. Eventually it comes home, just like it did in World War II. So it doesn't mean you have to intervene everywhere. It doesn't mean you don't have to be careful. You always have to do risk assessments and benefit versus cost. That's important, but I can't create a formula for it. It's different for every situation. And I'll leave it there.
So first of all, restrainers weren't opposed to going into Afghanistan and achieving a few things. One is punishing the Taliban for their state support of anti-American terrorism. Two is to decimate al-Qaeda as an effective terrorist organization. And three, killing or capturing Osama bin Laden. And thankfully, the Navy killed him. So those are the three things that we needed to accomplish, and I favored those. In fact, I went to Afghanistan too because I thought that was an important fight for us. The problem was the nation-building program that followed after that, and that was a disaster. The other thing is, follow the counterfactual, right? The Iraq War killed 4,000 American soldiers, injured tens of thousands of them. All the GWOT combined, there's been about 1 million disability claims. So we have to think about the cost too. And the other thing is that there was absolutely, and I know the congressman didn't say this, but a lot of neoconservatives do, they believe that there was a connection between al-Qaeda and Iraq, and they sold that myth in the Weekly Standard about a meeting in Prague, all this stuff, all garbage, right? Iraq had nothing to do with us trying to stop the spread of anti-American terrorism as encapsulated by al-Qaeda. It was a separate thing. It was an attempt, we heard about immanentizing the eschaton in the previous panel, is an attempt to remake the Middle East in a way that would be favorable to us by spreading democracy and punishing states that had different systems, under the idea that the United States, to be safe, the world has to be look like it. That's the view of the French revolutionaries, and they were always at war, and it ultimately hurt the French Republic. That's one of the reasons why we have to avoid going down that path. But we have to look at the costs of these things, and the costs are enormous. Billions of dollars for Ukraine. We have limited capabilities right now due to that to confront China if we needed to. We have to think about the fact that there were trillions of dollars spent in the GWOT, in the Middle East, for very little benefit. And I don't buy the argument about Iran. We could get into that later. But the fact is that the most important thing that keeps us safe from nuclear weapons in Iran is our own nuclear capability that can deter. We didn't need to do regime change in Moscow in order for us to win the Cold War. And then getting back to the Cold War, here's what I would say about Ukraine. Here's a counterfactual. Okay, let's say everything you said happens and Russia is on the border of NATO. The fact is that the United States won the Cold War with Ukraine being part of the Soviet Union. We still won the Cold War. In fact, it was part of Russia, okay? And therefore, it is not a fundamental vital interest for us to make sure that Ukraine is sovereign and free. And then the whole issue of whether they're all that free in the first place is another thing, because it's not as great a regime as it's pointed out on television. Better than Moscow for sure, but not exactly the regime of Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, and so forth. So again, like I appreciate the counterfactual analysis. It's a good one, and it helps us get at what's the logic and assumptions behind these things. But again, I think that the United States, if we looked at the last 25 years, if we had pursued a very different approach, right? After 9/11, we went after the Taliban, punished them, killed bin Laden, put our efforts on going after al-Qaeda instead of distracting ourselves with Saddam Hussein and George W. Bush's, weird daddy issues, and actually focused on that, we would have had a Middle East and a world that was much better, and we would have spent a lot less than the trillions of dollars that have created so many of our financial problems.
So I think I tend to agree with Dr. Ruger theoretically and with Congressman Crenshaw practically. And I think the reason is because of the definition of the term interests, right? So Dr. Ruger says you use the American Armed Forces to defend America's territory and its interests. And that's really the key, is how you define interests. And the problem is that we can define our own interests, but in certain ways, right, again, in a zero-sum geopolitical environment, others define our interests for us as well. And so, yes, it is true that Vladimir Putin sees Ukraine as historically part of Russia. That is in part because, as someone with a PhD in Russian history, I can tell you that he's a very bad Russian historian. But that is not the only reason why he has invaded Ukraine, right? If you see the interview with Tucker Carlson, the first half of it is a lecture on Russian history, which is basically illiterate. The second half is all this stuff about NATO. Because he does care about NATO, and there is this whole story about what happened to Russia and NATO after the Cold War. And the problem is you have to understand the way both the Russians and the Chinese have understood the end of the Cold War and what's happened since the end of the Cold War. There is nothing that the CCP has spent more time studying over the past 30 years than why the Soviet Union collapsed. Xi Jinping's nightmare, when he wakes up in the middle of the night, goes to the bathroom and looks in the mirror, he sees Mikhail Gorbachev. Right? That's what he's afraid of. So all they do is figure out, how do we not end up like the Soviet Union? And one of the things they've come up with is that the Soviet Union, it wasn't economic planning, because God help us, we don't want to give up centralized economic control, right? And it wasn't that the Soviet economy was a disaster or whatever. No, it was Western ideological influence, cultural influence. There's this term in Chinese they use now, historical nihilism, right? Which is all a way of saying that, if Western ideas and Western culture becomes dominant, right? If people in China and Russia go to the movies and see Captain America defending freedom, right? And see, these democratic ideas. I mean, this goes back 10 years ago. Ann Applebaum has a fantastic piece in the Washington Post about how people, in Russia wanted to know what the United States stood for. They said it stood for LGBT. They didn't know what LGBT stood for, but that's what America stood for, right? So that's why, right? This is about combating the notion of American values because, right? China does not want to be the global hegemon the United States is. China does not want, its navy patrolling the Panama Canal. That's not what China's looking for. But China also does not want to be a regional power because it can't, right? The idea is that if China is this anachronistic regime, the one totalitarian single-party regime in a world that's democratizing with multi-party elections and freedom of speech, then China's a dinosaur, right? Then China's days are numbered. So it has to fight this battle, right? It can't allow this ideological influence to become dominant. It can't allow Western institutions to remain dominant. And so there is a battle against Western ideology institutions that carry them, and that includes things like NATO. And so yes, NATO is a target of Putin. The question is, what happens if Putin had his troops right on the border of Ukraine? The answer is he would try to test NATO, right? And if he could invade Latvia, and it turns out, guess what? NATO's not really going to defend Latvia, then the whole thing's a dead letter, right? NATO's a dead letter. All American security guarantees around the world are a dead letter. Israel needs a new foreign policy. Saudi Arabia needs a new foreign policy. All of Latin America needs a new foreign policy. Taiwan certainly needs a new foreign policy, as do the Japanese, the Australians, and everybody else, right? The whole thing collapses, a house of cards, if he can create a diversion among the Russian population in Latvia, which gives an excuse for the little green men to go in, and all of a sudden NATO troops don't show up because the Germans aren't going to fight to defend Latvia, right? So that's what this is about, right? This is about the idea that Russia and China are chafing under a global system they think is stacked against them with an ideology that threatens to undermine their regimes. And so therefore it is a global threat, right? Because they perceive it that way. So to get back to interests, right? How does it affect American interests? Well, what China wants is China does not want to be defending Morocco. It does not want to be defending Bolivia. But it wants to live in a world in which if the government of Bolivia is faced with a choice between doing what the United States wants and doing what China wants, right, the weight of its own interest, the weight of its economic interest will force it to do what China wants, right? The fact that China is the largest trading partner of the majority of countries in the world, including in Latin America, right, is what China feels gives it the leverage that one day, if it needs Bolivia's vote, or if it needs the signature of a Bolivian minister on a contract, or if it needs the Bolivian government to push out an American company in favor of a Chinese company, that China's writ will run, right? That's what it's hoping. So there is this global conflict, and unfortunately, for the way China and Russia see the world, it is zero-sum.
So a lot of the questions that are coming in are about China. So I guess I'll just ask straight up, what should the US strategy be towards China?
You go first.
Okay.
Yeah, so obviously that's an enormous question. I think one can take it, militarily, economically, diplomatically. I think, so first, again, to understand what the United States strategy is towards China, we should have to figure out, first of all, what China is, right? What does China want? What kind of threat does China present? China does want the United States militarily out of East Asia. It does not want to replace the role of the American military around the world. It wants the dollar to stop being the global reserve currency, but does not want to replace the dollar with the renminbi. So in many ways, what China wants is not to replace American hegemony, but to destroy American hegemony and leave essentially nothing in its place. So that's one problem with interest, right? What does the world look like if there is no hegemon, right? If there's no reserve currency, if nobody's patrolling the sea lanes, right? That's a problem. So that's one issue. The second issue is, okay, so what kind of a threat does China represent, right? Chinese economy, there's been discussion about the Chinese economy has sort of peaked, demographically it's in decline. What does that mean? So it's a complicated question, where China's going economically, but I would say is this, right? The economic numbers that we look at the rate of China's GDP growth, right? Which doesn't mean a whole lot because we don't know what those numbers really mean, whether they're true. But the question is, okay, what does it use growth for? So one thing you use your economy for is to fund your military, right? Can China fund a larger military and a smaller economy? Yes, right? Right now it's spending 1% to 2% of GDP on the military. The United States is already spending 3%. Both of those numbers are much lower than they were in the Cold War. China can afford to build a much larger military on an even smaller economy. What about its global reach? Right, so as I just said, the United States is heavily dependent on the domestic market, right? 70% of American GDP is consumed at home. In China, that number is much smaller. The Chinese consumer consumes less, which is why, even on a smaller economy, that's why China is the trading partner of the majority of the world's countries. And so that gives it leverage abroad because it consumes so little domestically, despite the fact that ultimately its economy is smaller. Okay, what about technologically? So in key areas, AI and such, right? This is what the White House is very concerned with now. China can advance in those areas, even if overall economic growth is slow. So the point is, a slowing Chinese economy is not necessarily going to decrease China's capability. It's not going to necessarily decrease the Chinese threat. And of course, it could make it more belligerent. Is it going to lead to domestic unrest and the collapse of the regime? Probably not. You want to bet on the collapse of the Chinese regime, go ahead, but people have been doing that for, since Tiananmen Square. So given that, right, I think we have to assume that China is a durable competitor. It's a competitor which sees the world order as unfair, right? Why should the United States be playing this role in East Asia? One thing that Chinese love to say is, we always talk about the South China Sea, and what if an American ship runs into a Chinese ship in the South China Sea? Well, it's never going to happen in the Caribbean because there are no Chinese ships there, right? So why should American ships be there? So we have to figure out, right? This is one of the things that Dr. Ruger said is a fundamental American interest is freedom of navigation. Well, the South China Sea is a crucial part of that. This is something that China sees as its domestic territory, and so there already is a clash of interest that puts us at odds with China. So it seems like we do have, there's an impossibility for us to sort of accommodate a Chinese sphere of influence. So I think we have to do is we have to build up a coterie, maybe not an Asian NATO quite, but we have to build up a group of countries that can act in concert, that will assume some of the burden, but will actually maintain a military perimeter in the South China Sea and such. I think we can't set a technological barrier to Chinese growth. So the thing that the Biden administration has been doing about saying that, well, we have to maintain technological leadership. The problem is, for China to live in a world in which America, especially the technological leader, means that China is always unsafe. If you create a situation in which American security and Chinese security is a zero-sum game, only one country can be safe at a time, you're sort of setting up the road for conflict. So given that we don't want this to end in conflict, this is not the Cold War, this doesn't have an end date, this is not World War II, right? The Chinese regime we can collapsing. So we can't set up a situation which will make conflict inevitable. So we want, right, again, a coterie of nations around China, but we don't want to make conflict inevitable. Beyond that, I think I want to hand it over to my colleagues.
Yeah, sure. So I think that our most important threats to the American way of life and the conservative approach to the world are at home in the United States. So I will premise what I'm going to say about China next based on that. But other than that, I think China is our most important strategic competitor, and we need to handle it with care because unlike the old Soviet Union, there are benefits from a good relationship with China as well as substantial threats and costs. I think decoupling would be a huge mistake for the United States. And so again, we have to treat them in a weird way because we can't just treat them in Cold War I views, right? Like the enemy, we have very little relationship to them. Sometimes we ease the spigot and let them have some wheat, right? Which is what we did in the Cold War. No, China is much more complex. So I think we have to handle with care, which means that I think we have to push them on things like tech theft, IP protection. But I think we should actually still try to encourage trade with China because it's beneficial. And then the other thing is I think we have to have a policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. I think it would be very dangerous for us to do what unfortunately even some Republicans want to do, which is to more substantially promote the idea that the United States will come to their defense. I think we should maintain strategic ambiguity, especially because I just don't think the United States is all that ready to fight a war over Taiwan or very desirous. I mean, it's one thing to say it. We need to stand up against the Chi-Coms. It's another thing when, like, a fifth of you are conscripted to go fight over there instead of working at, a great law firm. Look, your parents didn't even want you to go to school during COVID, which had a very low death rate. You think they're going to be excited about you going over there and, being on a destroyer and fighting it out with the Chinese torpedoes, missiles, and drones? Okay. And again, I don't think we've contemplated, the war in Ukraine has given us some sense about what, modern warfare that isn't kind of us fighting against, relatively poor people in the Middle East. And it's scary. It's a wicked problem in the Navy, right? Look what's happened to the Russian Navy against a very small and not very strong set of Ukrainian capabilities. And so there's a scholar at the Notre Dame, a guy named Eugene Goltz, has done a lot of work on A2AD, anti-access area denial technologies, and what it means for the future of conflict. And it's kind of scary. But here's the thing that might be the saving grace. It may mean that A2AD capabilities for China, who are only, 80 miles off the shore of, Taiwan is only 80 miles off the shore, they could use missiles, torpedoes, sensors, and drones, et cetera, in a way that could keep us out. But if we could help promote Taiwan to be a porcupine and to also have those capabilities, we might be able to help them keep China out as well. And so it becomes what Eugene Goltz says is the no man's sea. That might be the best we could do, but we have to have a willing partner. Taiwan hardly spends anything on its own defense, and it spends the wrong way. The other thing you could say too is look, sometimes in international politics you have to do triage. And even if China were the greatest threat out there in the world and we needed to actually potentially fight World War III at some point, you still have to draw lines geographically, the ones that make the most sense. And there I think we have to talk about how Guam, Australia, Japan are frankly easier to defend and more important than Taiwan, which is a wicked problem. And it may come to that, and I don't love that idea. I hate the idea that Hong Kong now is kind of a pale imitation of its former self. Love Hong Kong, spent a lot of time there. So it's kind of scary, but again, China this is the thing we have to focus on, and we need to stop focusing so much time on the Middle East. It just isn't that important, and we're wasting time confronting and dealing and handling China the way we need to.
Okay. I think a couple of things. I'm just trying to think of some things that weren't hit. So, reforming our EPA, that would help, because how is that connected? Because under this administration, especially, the EPA is, I think, one of the most dangerous threats to your way of life on a daily basis. That's what our subcommittee oversees. And it's all about destroying these refineries, stopping these pipelines, just prohibiting your ability to produce more energy, prohibiting your ability to permit more mines, et cetera, et cetera. And we're still permitting some. There's some good news out there, don't get me wrong. But certainly our environmental regulations would never allow us to do the processing that China does. China does like 70% of the world's processing. They are not a resource-rich country. They go abroad, they get it, they bring it back. They've cornered the market of that middleman market, that processing. We could easily do it, or maybe Mexico could do it. I don't know. But the EPA has actually just put out new proposals for regulations on particulate matter, because apparently the air we're breathing is just too gross and dirty, and we're all dying. I've seen no evidence for that. I've seen evidence for 70% increase in air quality over the last 30 years, but I don't know. So that's a major thing. You don't want to try to outcompete China in ways and compete with their strengths. And their strengths are spending a crap ton of money, going into a ton of debt. They'll probably end up in a house of cards collapse at some point, but they do that all over the world, and they're always willing to raise that bar. And that's how they capture those developing countries in there. We hear about it all the time, and it mostly concerns being places in South America, because this is our hemisphere. And we have to need a way to compete with that. We are not good at competing in that way and showing them the financial services that we have, say Import-Export Bank, things like that. We have not done a good job, I think, really strategically using those assets. I don't think our State Department does a really good job taking those meetings with foreigners, using US aid to gain leverage and alliances. I think we could do a better job there. You absolutely need a strong alliance in the Pacific. We have begun to build that. You have the Quad, the Australia, Japan, India, US relationship. I even proposed in the last NDA that we actually create a physical headquarters to really codify that, make it something real. So getting India on your side is a huge part of deterring China. In the end, it's about deterrence. And we have a lot of interest in deterring aggression against Taiwan. 90% of the most advanced semiconductors are made in Taiwan. That will have a major effect on your way of life and every single thing you do. Ukraine's economy isn't nothing either. The reason you didn't feel a whole lot of it was because the Ukraine economy kept going. They kept exporting a lot of food. They kept exporting neon, half the world's neon, which is used in semiconductors. Most of our pig iron ore that we use to make our steel comes from Ukraine. The thing about it is their economy kept going because honestly, they're pretty badass. And you could be in a full-fledged World War II, like Call of Duty style battle, and then like go 45 minutes away and a restaurant's open and you can get a steak. I mean, these people are amazing. And so, but what's the point of it's not just their economy that matters, it's that China has a clock and they're like, how long does the West really last with their friends? That's good to know for our calculations when we want to take Taiwan. And I hope they're second guessing a lot, because the Chinese are not good at doing anything militarily because they've never done it. There's nobody really alive who's done it. Their last war was what, like 1979, didn't go well. And I think they're realizing that now. A maritime invasion is very difficult. Also worth noting, there's a discussion out there sometimes that there's competing resources if we want to support Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. The truth of the matter is there are not really competing resources. These are totally different kinds of weapon systems. We have been way too slow getting some of those weapon systems to Taiwan that they need. Think like anti-ship Harpoon missiles, for instance. Make it the Porcupine. That's because of our military-industrial base has basically been just decimated over the last few years. And everybody thinks it's super strong and productive and profitable. That's not exactly true. One of the benefits of the Ukraine war was waking us up to that, because we found out we had to produce all these things, and all these production lines, whether it's Lockheed or Northrop Grumman running the production line, well, they'd gone through atrophy because there's no more orders. We're not ordering a bunch of new missiles of this and that or artillery rounds, so those production lines go away. And this isn't like World War II where everything was just made of metal. This is like really exquisite weaponry. And there's like 1,000 small companies that are part of that supply chain to make that exquisite piece of weaponry. And they go out of business, or they close down, or the people who run it are specialized and in their 50s they retired, who knows. So it's been very difficult to get those weapon system production lines back on. Thankfully the spending and the efforts in Ukraine have actually massively helped us in that direction. It'd be scary to think where we'd be if we hadn't had that. We definitely would not be able to defend Taiwan. And defending Taiwan does not have to mean literally sending you to Taiwan. It does not have to mean that. And I think I'm against strategic ambiguity at this point. I am one of those people who says, I think it's an old saying at this point. I think ambiguity invites aggression. President Biden gave Putin ambiguity over Ukraine. Oh, maybe, I don't know if we'll do anything. Kind of depends. That's what he said. Green light, boom. You know what Trump said? If you invade Ukraine, I'll bomb Moscow. Well, actually, he said, I'll bomb the shit out of Moscow. And he says the same thing about China. And so I always find it really odd, the America First movement right now is like the hyper-isolationist movement, and and that's just not how Trump governed at all. He didn't get us in any more wars. I'm like, bro, he went into Syria like we went into Syria real hard, killing ISIS as soon as he became president. Like, don't tell me he's this like, you know, he murdered Qasem Soleimani while he was on a layover in Baghdad, just murdered. And don't tell me Trump's like this isolationist, you know, who refuses to intervene. It's just a weird, I don't know where this mythology is coming from. So I like this foreign policy, to be honest. That's enough to say about that.
Okay, so we're about at time. So just one sentence each. What is the biggest foreign policy concern over the next decade for the United States? One sentence.
You want like a national security answer? It's cyber intrusions. It's like way worse than you think. I'm on the intelligence community. Being on the intelligence community, I'm sometimes terrified, but most of the time I'm like, wow, we do that. That's amazing. Good America. So it's a mix of both, but yeah, I would say cyber intrusions.
I like that the congressman used a lot of semicolons, so I can too, for one sentence. The neglected...
You guys have been way more long-winded than me. Professors.
We'll give you some more time. I think a big threat actually is the continued dominance of the foreign policy conversation by the foreign policy establishment in Washington, the so-called blob, because I think they bring lots of bad assumptions about the nature of the world, about the nature of American power, and about how we need to proceed that is actually self-defeating. And I think that we need a new batch of people to be injected with different ideas because a lot of those old ideas didn't work, or they're not as relevant to the modern world as they may have been in 1973.
So I will be very concise. There are lots of other threats. The biggest threat to American national security is the functionality of America's governing institutions going forward. Nothing else comes close.
Well, thank you, Congressman Crenshaw, Dr. Ruger, Dr. Friedman. Thank you for being here with us today, giving us your time and sharing those valuable insights. We'll take a 15-minute break. The next panel will start at 3 p.m., so please be in your seats at that point, and we look forward to learning more as the day progresses.